Did you know that today's multi-billion-dollar Hollywood industry, the massive Marvel and DC empires running the world right now, literally started from a bunch of cheap 2-cent papers found in trash cans? Papers that the U.S. government once labeled as the main cause of youth crime and corruption, set on fire, and drove their creators to the brink of total ruin. But how did these throwaway magazines turn into the most popular art form of the 21st century? What dirty thefts and massive betrayals were hidden behind the creation of Batman and Spider-Man that no one dared to talk about for years? And how did one publisher end up having to hand over all their characters to their main rival for free just because of a weird rule? Hey guys, welcome back to Comic Station. Today we're taking a crazy trip back in time, from the dingy basements of the 1930s and the birth of the very first superhero, through World War II, bloody censorship, and the bankruptcy of massive giants, all the way to comics becoming a sacred art form. If you want to know how DC, Marvel, and the rest of the industry built themselves up from absolute zero, buckle up, because this is the most complete story of the origin of comic books you'll ever hear. Without further ado, let's jump straight into part 1. Alright, before we jump into our time machine, let's clear up a simple but fundamental question. What actually is a comic? A lot of people think comics are just a bunch of illustrated children's storybooks. But structurally speaking, a comic is sequential art, the magic blend of image plus text that lets you feel movement and time on a static sheet of paper, just like watching a movie. In a comic, the story is told inside frames called panels. The dialogue goes into speech bubbles, and those exciting sound effects like boom, pow, or bang become the background audio for all the drama. The real magic of comics happens in that empty space between the frames, where your own brain has to fill in the gap between two images. That's why comics are called the eighth art, because it's a medium where the audience actually does half the directing in their own heads. But where do you think the whole idea and formula for comics came from? It wasn't like a helicopter or a car that just got invented overnight. Humans have been obsessed with visual storytelling for thousands of years. The very first inspirations for comics were actually cave paintings. Primitive humans drew sequences of images showing a hunt to capture time and motion. Later on, Egyptian hieroglyphs and reliefs did the exact same thing, serial images on temple walls telling the story of the pharaohs' lives. In ancient Rome, they carved stories of wars frame by frame on massive historic columns, so anyone looking at them could understand the whole story. However, the final direct spark for modern comics was struck in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European artists started drawing political cartoons and satirical picture stories in magazines. They realized that pairing short text with sequential drawings had 100 times more impact on the audience. Even so, there was still no such thing as a comic book booklet on the market until a ruthless battle between New York newspapers changed everything. Alright, so we've made it to the late 19th century, the 1890s. Back then, there was no TV, no internet, and definitely no smartphones. Everyone's main source of news and entertainment boiled down to just one thing: newspapers.
Right in the heart of New York, two ruthless media tycoons, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, were locked in a bloody, all-out war to sell more papers. They quickly realized people didn't have the patience for long, dry political articles, so they brought out a deadly new weapon: newspaper strips. In 1895, a character named the Yellow Kid was born. He was a bald little kid wearing a nightcap and a long yellow shirt, with his dialogue actually printed right on his shirt. This character became so insanely popular that he completely blew up the media scene back then. For the first time in history, people weren't just buying the newspaper for the news. They were lining up just to see what funny mess this kid had gotten himself into that week. When the newspaper giants saw how well this worked, comic strips slowly moved away from pure comedy. Soon enough, action and adventure strips like Tarzan, Buck Rogers, and Flash Gordon started invading the pages. Newspaper strips had officially conquered all of America, but there was still one massive problem. These stories were just a few tiny panels squeezed into the margins of the paper. People would buy the newspaper, read the strip, and throw the paper in the trash the very next day. Nobody ever imagined you could pull these stories out of the margins and print them in their own independent booklet or magazine. Nobody. Until 1933, when a genius with a crazy idea and a few staples took the most legendary risk of his life. It was 1933. America was getting crushed under the Great Depression. People barely had money for bread, so cheap entertainment was practically worth its weight in gold. Amidst all this chaos, a guy named Max Gaines, who worked as a salesman for a printing and advertising company, stumbled upon a warehouse packed with old leftover newspapers and comic strips. His boss wanted to toss all those papers into the trash, but Max had a crazy idea pop into his head, an idea that would change the course of entertainment history forever. Max Gaines folded those giant newspaper pages in half, trimmed off the margins with scissors, and bound them together right down the middle with a simple stapler. The result? A neat, handy little magazine, just about the size of today's comic books. He named this new product Famous Funnies. It was nothing more than a collection of those same funny newspaper strips, but this time packaged into a neat 36-page booklet. Now, Gaines's big idea wasn't just folding paper. He went straight to major toothpaste and food manufacturing companies and pitched them a deal. Buy these booklets from me and give them away as free promotional gifts to your customers. The result? A sweet, glorious disaster. The response from kids and adults was so insane that huge lines started forming outside stores. Overnight, Max Gaines realized he was sitting on an absolute gold mine. He figured out that people were actually willing to pay real cash for these booklets. But there was one massive problem. What was that critical issue? Every single comic book on the market was just a recycled reprint of old newspaper strips. Pretty quickly, that well ran dry. Publishers were running out of inventory, and people weren't about to keep dropping 10 cents on stories they had already read in the papers weeks ago. This is when publishers realized that if they wanted this industry to survive, they had to take a whole new risk, producing 100% original content. They started hiring young, broke, unknown writers and artists whose only dream was to create fresh stories. No more copy-pasting newspaper strips. Comic books were finally getting their own unique worlds, dedicated characters, and standalone storylines.
By 1937, magazines like Detective Comics, which is literally the DC we know today, hit the market, packed cover to cover with completely original detective and adventure stories. Comic books had officially broken free from the shadow of newspapers to become a fully independent medium. But the real masterpiece and true revolution happened when two poor teenage kids from Cleveland came up with a weird character wearing a red cape called Superman. At first, they took their idea to newspaper editors, but they got shot down immediately. What is this crazy nonsense with flying guys? Nobody's going to read this. That was until 1938, when the publisher of an independent magazine called Action Comics No. 1 bought those rejected sketches, rearranged the layout, and slapped Superman right on the cover. The result was an absolute storm. Superman blew up so hard as a standalone comic book that the exact same newspapers that had rejected him came crawling back, begging for permission to run Superman strips in their papers. With Superman's insane success in 1938, the floodgates opened to a whole new era for the comic industry, a time we now call the Golden Age. Kids and adults were head over heels for these superhuman characters, and every publisher suddenly knew the secret recipe to getting rich: a tight, colorful costume, a symbol on the chest, and weird superpowers. Right in the middle of this superhero fever, the publisher behind Superman, Detective Comics, decided to abbreviate its name using the first two letters of that hit magazine, and the legendary DC brand was officially born. By 1939, DC saw that people wanted a new hero, but not another invincible alien from outer space like Superman. They wanted a dark, human, revenge-driven hero. And that's how a character named Batman was born in issue number 27 of Detective Comics. Unlike Superman, Batman didn't have any superpowers. He was just a furious human working in the shadows of Gotham City, fighting criminals using nothing but his intelligence, high-tech gear, and brutal fists. The arrival of Batman and his sidekick, Robin, proved that the superhero world wasn't limited to just one formula. Soon enough, DC completely took over the American comic book market by creating iconic villains like the Joker. Newsstands were packed with comics. Millions of copies were selling every month, and the comic industry had exploded into a multi-million-dollar giant. But right at the peak of all this success and hype, the dark shadow of World War II suddenly engulfed the entire planet. The question was, how was the comic world going to face the biggest, most horrific real-life nightmare in human history? The answer was hiding behind a controversial magazine cover that shook comic history forever. In 1941, America was right on the brink of entering World War II, and fear and anxiety had gripped the entire nation. In the middle of all this chaos, an up-and-coming publisher called Timely Comics, which years later became Marvel, did something nobody in Hollywood or the media had the guts to do. Two genius artists named Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created a character named Captain America. On the cover of that very first issue, Captain America walked right into Nazi headquarters and landed a heavy right hook straight on Adolf Hitler's jaw. And keep in mind, this was 9 months before the US even officially joined the war. That cover hit the public like an atomic bomb. The issue sold over 1 million copies. Comic books were no longer just silly kids' entertainment. They had turned into the most powerful tool for propaganda and boosting public morale.
The U.S. government bought millions of copies and shipped them straight to the front lines for soldiers to read in the trenches, giving them a massive boost of motivation to crush the Nazis. The golden age of comics had reached its absolute peak. But when the war ended in 1945, a sudden crisis grabbed the industry right by the throat. The main enemy, the Nazis, was gone, and people were totally over reading repetitive stories about superheroes with blowing capes. Superhero comic sales plummeted hard. To save themselves from bankruptcy, publishers pivoted to a completely new and dark genre: horror, gore, and crime comics. It was a genre that went so over the top that it caused the public, the police, and even the U.S. Senate to rise up against comic books, a backlash that led to one of the darkest eras of censorship in art history. Once World War II wrapped up, a weird shift happened in the market. Readers and teenagers just didn't care about superheroes wearing tight, colorful suits and preaching moral advice anymore. To the readers, those invincible heroes had just become repetitive and boring. Superhero comic sales crashed so hard that even Captain America and The Flash got completely canceled and shut down. Right in the middle of all this chaos, a bold publisher named Bill Gaines, the son of that famous Max Gaines, stepped up and transformed EC Comics. He realized the new audience was craving real shocks and genuine excitement, so he tapped into a brand new genre: crime, horror, and shock comics. Magazines like Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror were born. Stories packed with zombies, decapitations, betrayals, serial killers, and bloody revenge. The result? A massive explosion in the market. Kids and teenagers were absolutely obsessed with these horror comics. EC Comics conquered the entire industry overnight, forcing all the other publishers to stuff their own books with blood and gore just to keep up. Comic books had shifted from innocent kids' stories into the darkest, most violent medium in the hands of children. But this wild, unchecked violence triggered parents, teachers, and churches everywhere. American society felt threatened, and soon enough, a famous psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham stepped into the ring with a controversial book to announce, "Comic books are turning your kids into criminals and psychopaths." In 1954, Dr. Frederick Wortham published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. His claim became the biggest news bomb of the year. Wortham claimed that horror comics were driving kids toward delinquency and crime, that Batman and Robin were promoting illicit relationships, and that Superman was a dangerous fascist. Now, quick side note, honest to God, his claim that Batman and Robin were having a sexual relationship was pure, total nonsense. But regardless, it dragged comics straight into court. This claim forced the U.S. Senate to step in, leading to the biggest trial in comic book history. And another key detail to keep in mind, back then, explicit sexual themes and suggestive scenes had really started creeping into comics, which played a massive part in fueling the outrage against them. The media drummed up a terrifying negative wave. It got so out of hand that people were literally burning comic books in the streets. Bill Gaines, the head of EC Comics, took the microphone at the Senate hearing to defend his art form, but under the intense pressure of the senators, he got completely crushed. Society was treating comic books like a lethal poison for the youth. Publishers felt the shadow of shutdowns and prison sentences looming over their heads, so to stay alive, they were forced into a brutal wave of self-censorship. They founded the Comics Code Authority, or the CCA.
From that point on, no comic was legally allowed to hit the presses without the CCA's stamp of approval. But the rules of this organization were an absolute disaster. Words like horror and vampire were banned completely. No police officer could ever be defeated in a story. No villain could ever go unpunished. And any sign of blood, violence, or dark atmosphere was completely censored. The result? The comic industry was officially paralyzed. The massive EC Comics went completely bankrupt and collapsed. Stories became bland, childish, and heavily sanitized. Readers and teenagers who had zero interest in safe, corny stories straight up quit reading comics, and sales crashed to catastrophic levels. The comic book industry was taking its final breaths. Everyone thought comic books were dead and buried for good. But nobody knew that out of those exact ashes, a new hero was about to dash out at the speed of light to kick off a revolution called the Silver Age of comics, an era that would completely rebirth Marvel and DC. It was 1956. The comic industry was suffocating under the pressure of CCA censorship, but DC decided to take a crazy risk. They realized if they couldn't tell violent stories, they had to push readers towards sci-fi and futuristic tech. In issue 4 of Showcase magazine, DC completely redesigned its classic character, the Flash. No more outdated helmet and simple stories. Now we were introduced to Barry Allen, a forensic scientist who gains the speed of light after a freak laboratory accident involving lightning and chemicals. With this single comic, the Silver Age was officially born. The response was so overwhelming that DC rushed to modernize the rest of its lineup. Green Lantern, Aquaman, Martian Manhunter, and finally the assembly of the first major superhero team in history, the Justice League. DC was once again the undisputed king of the market, raking in piles of cash. On the other side of the battlefield, their rival publisher, Atlas Comics, formerly Timely Comics, was practically down to begging on the streets. They were barely surviving by printing a few ridiculous monster comics, and they even had to rely on DC's own distribution network just to get their books onto newsstands. The head of this bankrupt company turned to his 38-year-old editor and said, "DC is crushing the market with their Justice League comic. Build me a superhero team just like them." That editor was none other than Stan Lee. Stan Lee, who was completely burned out on comics at the time and was ready to hand in his resignation, decided to pour everything left in his crazy mind onto the page one last time. A move that not only saved his company, but rebranded it as Marvel and sparked the single greatest revolution in comic book history. Before Stan Lee could resign, his wife told him, "Since you're leaving anyway, at least write this last book the way you want to, not the way the bosses want." So Stan Lee teamed up with the legendary artist Jack Kirby. In 1961, they published a comic called The Fantastic Four. This wasn't just a regular comic book. It was a heavy slap in the face to the entire industry. Unlike DC's squeaky clean, perfect heroes who never had any real-life problems, Stan Lee's heroes were real humans with real problems. The Fantastic Four didn't have secret identities. They argued among themselves, fell behind on rent, and even held petty grudges against each other. Right after that, next-level characters were born one after another. The Hulk, a monster born out of internal rage. Thor, a mythological god with human pride. And the X-Men, a brilliant metaphor for racial discrimination and societal prejudice. But the ultimate masterpiece happened in 1962. Stan Lee and the genius artist Steve Ditko created a hero that every single executive was against: Spider-Man. The executives were like, "Spiders are gross. Plus, a high school teenager can't be the main hero. Teenagers are only supposed to be sidekicks." Stan Lee didn't listen. Peter Parker was an orphaned, shy, broke teenager getting crushed under the weight of school and real life. When Spider-Man hit the market, it absolutely shattered every sales record on the shelf. Teenagers finally saw a hero who looked, felt, and struggled just like them. Stan Lee kicked off a system called the Marvel Method, which boosted the speed and quality of comic creation tenfold.
He talked to readers in the back pages of the comics like a close friend, completely transforming the way creators connected with their audience. Marvel went from a bankrupt company to the undisputed giant of pop culture, an era we call the Marvel Revolution, the heart of the Silver Age. The 60s wrapped up in absolute glory, but as we rolled into the 1970s, everything shifted once again. The real world hit a crisis: the Vietnam War, drug epidemics, and systemic racism. Comic books couldn't stay hidden in a fantasy world anymore. It was time for the Bronze Age to begin, an era where the greatest heroes suffered defeat, true loves died, and the line between the real streets and the comic world was erased forever. The first massive spark was struck in 1971. The U.S. Department of Health actually asked Stan Lee to write a Spider-Man comic warning kids about the dangers of drugs. Stan Lee wrote a story where Harry Osborn, Peter Parker's best friend, comes within an inch of death due to pill addiction. But when he sent the issue to print, the Comics Code Authority, CCA, blocked it, saying, "Under our rules, mentioning drugs under any circumstance is strictly banned, even if your goal is educational." This was the moment Stan Lee pulled off the most legendary defiance against censorship in comic history. He decided to ship Spider-Man issues 96 through 98 straight to stores without the CCA stamp of approval. The result? Massive sales and overwhelming support from the public and teachers alike. The grip of the censorship authority was so thoroughly broken that they were forced to back down and rewrite their strict rules after 20 years. DC jumped right onto the bandwagon immediately after. In the legendary Green Lantern Green Arrow run, Green Arrow found out in absolute shock that his teenage sidekick, Speedy, was addicted to heroin. The iconic cover showing Green Arrow crying rocked the moral status quo of superhero storytelling to its core. Comic books had finally built up the courage to tackle real-world redlines. But breaking through censorship wasn't just about social issues. Writers realized it was time to tear down the fake safety net around superheroes, too. Before this, every reader knew that at the very last second, the hero would somehow save the day. Until 1973, when one of the most beloved characters in comic history was brought to the top of a bridge for an event that put the entire industry into mourning. In 1973, in issue 121 of The Amazing Spider-Man, a tragedy struck that shattered the entire comic book community. The Green Goblin threw Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker's first real love, off a bridge. Peter shot a web line to catch her, but the sudden jerk snapped her neck, and she died right there in Spider-Man's arms. It was an absolute shocker. For the first time in history, the hero had failed to save the most innocent person in his life. Gwen Stacy's death marked the official end of innocence for comic books. Readers realized that no character was safe anymore, and from that point on, a hero's actions carried real, painful consequences.
As the vibe grew darker, the old rule of heroes don't kill was thrown completely out the window. Readers were suddenly craving heroes who didn't play by the law, but instead took cold, hard revenge. This era birthed iconic, gritty anti-heroes: the Punisher, who executed criminals without mercy; Wolverine, with his bloody claws and dark past; and Ghost Rider. The Bronze Age proved that comic books had finally grown up. But all of these changes were just the warm-up for the 1980s, a decade where two genius writers, Frank Miller and Alan Moore, stepped in to elevate comic books from street entertainment into deep, philosophical, literary masterpieces for adults. An era known as the Modern Age, or the Dark Age. If you ask me what the single most critical, defining year in the entire 100-year history of comics is, I'd say it without missing a beat: 1986, the year two genius writers, Alan Moore and Frank Miller, came along and dropped two absolute atomic bombs on the literary world. Two masterpieces that proved comic books were no longer just cheap illustrated magazines, but literary and philosophical masterpieces for adults. First off, Frank Miller stormed onto the scene with his masterpiece, The Dark Knight Returns. He depicted a 55-year-old, tired, broken, and retired Batman putting the cowl back on in a corrupt and decaying Gotham City.
This comic completely rolled up and threw away the silly, lighthearted image of Batman. Miller crafted a political story packed with media critique and a brutal, bloody clash between Batman and Superman. Miller's Batman was no longer a handsome hero, he was a hardened, dark veteran. But the second masterpiece, which officially brought psychology and politics into comics, was none other than the graphic novel Watchmen, written by Alan Moore. Alan Moore stepped up and asked a dangerous psychological question. What if, in the real world, unstable people with deep complexes put on superhero suits? What happens to society then? The story of Watchmen showed a world where superheroes were humans riddled with psychological disorders, guilt, and selfishness. Watchmen was so deep and brilliant that it later became the only graphic novel ever to make Time magazine's list of the 100 best novels of all time. With these two books, a new phrase was born in society: graphic novel. The modern age had been conquered in full force, and comic sales were hitting billions of dollars. But the 1990s brought along a terrifying financial bubble, an economic bubble fueled by corporate greed that caused publishers to lose control, driving the entire comic industry to the very brink of total collapse. As we hit the 1990s, the comic book market turned into a gold mine, except the gold wasn't real. Readers and collectors genuinely believed that if they bought multiple copies of every comic and kept them mint condition, they'd be millionaires 20 years down the road. Publishers caught the scent of easy money and started printing millions of copies featuring gold foil, embossed, and holographic covers. Everything was going great until 1996, when this massive financial bubble burst. People realized these comics didn't actually have any special collector value, and overnight comic buying completely stopped. Sales plummeted by 80%. Publishers were collapsing one after another, and it got so bad that Marvel officially filed for bankruptcy in 1996. To survive and pay off its debts, Marvel was forced to make the darkest decision in its history, selling off the movie rights of its most beloved characters to Hollywood studios. They sold Spider-Man to Sony and the X-Men and Fantastic Four to Fox. But this forced fire sale actually opened the doors to a whole new world.
The insane success of the X-Men and Spider-Man movies in theaters proved just how much potential the comic world really had. That was until 2008, when Marvel put its remaining assets, Iron Man and Captain America, on the line to independently make its own movies. The result? The birth of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, MCU, and the transformation of comic books into the biggest, highest-grossing entertainment industry on planet Earth. Now, you might be asking yourself, what was DC doing during those exact years when Marvel was choking under debt and auctioning off its assets? Did they go bankrupt too? The answer is, thanks to the backing of media giant Warner Bros., DC didn't have the shadow of financial bankruptcy hanging over its head. However, they weren't immune to the 90s market crash either, and they were definitely feeling a heavy drop in readership. To shock the market and keep sales skyrocketing, DC pulled a desperate, suicidal move: kill and cripple its biggest icons. In 1992, DC published the insanely controversial comic, The Death of Superman. A monster named Doomsday beats Superman to death right in the middle of the streets of Metropolis. News of Superman's death hit the real-world media like an atomic bomb. People formed multi-mile lines just to buy a copy, and this issue sold over 6 million copies. Right after that, in the Nightfall storyline, a villain named Bane came along and literally broke Batman's back, leaving the Dark Knight bound to a wheelchair. With these moves, DC proved that not even the biggest icons in the world were safe, and they kept their market sizzling with media controversy. But DC's ultimate masterpiece during those crisis years for Marvel was founding a specialized imprint called Vertigo. DC launched Vertigo to publish dark, philosophical, occult, and 18-plus adult comics completely free from censorship restrictions. Masterpieces like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, Preacher, and Hellblazer, Constantine were born. Stories that officially turned the comic world into a masterclass of literature and philosophy. So, while Marvel was forced to sell off its characters to Hollywood just to stay alive, and later turn that desperation into the MCU empire,
DC held on to its throne in the publishing world by stirring up massive media hype in creating dark Vertigo masterpieces. Alright guys, now that we've made it through 100 years of history, blood, censorship, and comic masterpieces, it's time to enter the Hall of Fame, a place where we introduce the giants without whom the entertainment industry would be completely unimaginable. And of course, sitting right at the top of this hall are two undisputed kings who have built the most exciting rivalry in history for decades, DC and Marvel. DC Comics, the god of myth-making. DC is the company that laid the very first brick of superheroes by creating Superman and Batman. DC's philosophy has always been about humans trying to be gods, larger than life, iconic in mythical characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, who inspired everyone like ancient Greek statues. But on the other side, Marvel Comics, the god of humanity. Marvel completely flipped the formula. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's philosophy was all about gods trying to be human. Characters packed with flaws, anxiety, financial stress, and pain, living right here on Earth. Spider-Man, the Hulk, Iron Man, and the X-Men proved that underneath those flashy suits beat fragile, deeply relatable human hearts. This historic rivalry didn't destroy either of them. Instead, it raised the bar for the entire industry. When DC went dark, Marvel got funnier. When Marvel went grounded, DC went epic. But our Hall of Fame isn't just limited to these two giants.
Outside the realm of DC and Marvel, independent publishers were born who dared to push the boundaries of violence, fantasy, and storytelling to a whole new level. Publishers that gave the world masterpieces like Hellboy, The Walking Dead, and Spawn. Image Comics, the revolution of freedom. In 1992, 7 of Marvel's top artists, including Todd McFarlane, creator of Spawn, got sick and tired of having their rights trampled on. They walked out of Marvel together and built Image Comics. Their rule was simple. The creator owns 100% of their character. By creating legendary comics like Spawn, The Walking Dead, and Invincible, Image proved you could build multi-million-dollar giants even without DC or Marvel. Dark Horse Comics, the king of dark and gothic tales. A publisher that showed just how artistic, dark, and bold comic books could really be. Masterpieces like Hellboy, Sin City, and 300 came straight out of this company. Dark Horse proved that the comic world isn't just about superheroes. There's plenty of room for monsters, shadow-dwelling detectives, and dark mythology too. The comic book world has walked a crazy path, from cheap newspaper strips printed just to fill empty pages to explosive Senate hearings and suffocating censorship. But comic books survived, evolved, and turned into mankind's modern form of myth-making. Today, nobody looks at comics as just for kids anymore. These are the stories of our generation. Out of all these eras and publishers, which era in comic book history was your absolute favorite? And are you Team DC or Team Marvel? Let me know in the comments below. And if you had to pick just one single comic book to read for the rest of your life, which one would it be? Drop it in the comments. I'm reading every single one. If you enjoyed this deep historical journey, definitely hit that like button, share it with your comic fan friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next heavy-hitting deep dives. Thank you so much for sticking around till the very end. Until the next video and another crazy deep dive. Peace out.